Welcome to the Driving Change podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network, where we live at the intersection of neuroscience and storytelling. If you love great stories and you love understanding the mindset it takes to be a world-class change agent, then join us as our fascinating guests from all walks of life unpack their unique journeys of perseverance and passion, of expertise and experience, and be inspired to use your own story to drive change. Welcome back to the Driving Change podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield. Today, the guest is going to, this is going to be such a fun episode. So if you're listening, I want you to think about how far can you dive just holding your breath? And how long do you think you could stay down there? And then I want you to think about the person with that same skill leading an intense expedition in the Italian Dolomites, of hiking and outdoor guide. I want you to think you have that skill. Then I want you to think that you're a clinical psychologist who helps people become more resilient and self-aware during some of these not only external outdoor expeditions, but a lot of internal exploration between your ears. Well, today's guest is Dr. Iona Naismith. She's not just a leadership coach, she's a clinical psychologist, an adventurer, and she does everything that we've talked about, from taking expeditions to crazy places around the world. She's a free diver, so I think those people are a little bit crazy, so I'm going to learn a little bit more about Iona because I'm terrified of drowning. So free diving for me is like torture. But she's doing so much great work helping individuals and teams today as she guides leaders and people through complex challenges and diving, pun intended, into the depths of self-discovery. And we're gonna really unpack her story today and some of the work that she's doing around the world and her experience, and then take away some really, I think, some impactful life lessons I know that I have picked up from her, but I think you're going to pick up from her as well. So, Iona, welcome to the Driving Change podcast. It's an honor to have you on.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. And that was a very poetic and impressive introduction. I hope I can live up to all of that. But it certainly captures what I aspire to fill my life with. Obviously, that's very much a highlight reel, but absolutely, there is nothing I love more than working with people, hearing their stories and adventuring. So that absolutely captured my passions in one. Thanks.
Oh, excellent. And for those listening, we have this year, we've got a new sponsor. So this episode with Dr. Naismith is sponsored by Brain Trust, the neurocommunication company, where they leverage the latest in neuroscience and behavioral psychology to help individuals, especially sales organizations and managers and coaches, communicate more effectively using neuroscience and behavioral psychology. So you can see the pairing with Dr. Naismith today. It's a perfect fit. So let's dive in, pun intended again. I'm going to dad joke this thing to death with the free diving thing, I'm sure, before this episode's over. So let's dive in. And the rules around here are simple. The first question is, let's get to know you a little bit better. Take us on this origin story journey of little Iona, where she's from, who influenced her growing up. How did you get on this path to purpose that you're on today? Tell us that journey.
All right, great. Well, I'll start with where I grew up, which was at first on the fringes of the Scottish Highlands. And that, I think, influenced me in many ways. But one way was my dad, who's Scottish. And he would always tell us that if we waited for good weather, we would never have an adventure. So you can imagine how many scrapes that got us into. One of my favorite memories with him is we decided to go see a friend of his who lived in the middle of nowhere, nearest neighbor, 20-minute drive away, in a beautiful part of the Highlands. And when we got there, the valley was completely snowed in. Turned out she was skiing in and out of, her kids into school that week. But undeterred, my dad just said, let's get on the waterproof trousers, get on our head torches or lanterns, I think as you call them, headlights. We had all this sort of snow literally thigh high, and we were just wading through it, which is pretty exhausting, for about, I would say, 30 minutes. But we got to that little house and we saw this friend for tea. And it was just moments like that, I think, that so shaped my love of adventure and curiosity and exploring. So we started there. We ended up actually moving around quite a lot as a family. So different countries, different schools, different cultures and languages. And it was certainly an adventure, but as anyone will know who's done a move like that, it definitely brings its moments of challenge. And, with every school and with every culture, there's kind of new rules to learn. And I think every teenager's fear of not quite getting the rules and making a mistake. So actually, a lot of moments like that shaped me too. There was one moment I remember where some girls were laughing at me for not quite getting things. I was maybe 13 or 14. And another girl called them out on it and really stood up for me. And it was kind of small, but really mighty moments like that I think shaped me, that led me to become a clinical psychologist and eventually to do my doctorate in the science of compassion. And it's definitely a principle I kind of hold with me in all the work I do. So I would say probably the two kind of threads in my career and in my life are these two, one of compassion, one of curiosity. And I've always kind of tried to find a way to merge the two. And one light bulb moment for me was one day I was attending a lecture by Professor Vikram Patel. He's actually a psychiatrist, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and does some incredible work where they take all this evidence we have for, what works in terms of psychological well-being, and he's rolling it out in rural India and other places. So people who maybe haven't even completed secondary school, haven't been able to, are receiving therapy, and it is working and it has huge impacts. So I found that so inspiring. And I ended up, partly inspired by that, spending 8 years in Bogota in Colombia. And I was a professor of psychology there, and did a lot of research around trauma and around compassion, and also kind of worked teaching the next and training the next generation of therapists there. So I'm now back based in London, and I do quite different work. So my current job is, as you said, leadership coaching, therapy, things like that. And I, obviously in such a different environment, but it's amazing to me how I can still see the same principles work. So hearing people's stories, listening to them, helping them find new perspectives that make sense to them, certainly fills my curiosity cup every day, and I absolutely love it.
Wow. So I'm trying so hard to resist the urge to break into my Scottish brogue, because I want so badly. I like to do accents, and I'm terrible at all of them, but Scottish is one of my favorites.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That's a lot better than my Scottish accent.
So you kind of grew up in this environment with an adventuresome father and family, and you guys just, that was your normal. That was your normal every day was, you'd be wading waist deep through through snow to go visit a neighbor for tea. And so you got this kind of leadership or adventure bug as a kid growing up. And I think that a lot of us are formed and molded that in that time period where we just start to think those things are normal in life. And if it's a good environment, then those normal things translate into positive results in our adult, right? And if they're not so normal or good things, then they translate into bad, maybe ongoing habits in our lives. And for yours, you were able to take some of that into this idea of curiosity and turning it into a love of adventure. So before we get into some of the practical applications of neuroscience and compassion and all that, I'm curious, what made you get into leading expeditions and wanting to become a free diver? Obviously, you're filling that curiosity cup with adventure. But where was that first, like, hey, I'm going to go lead, I don't know, expeditions in the Italian Dolomites? Like, what was that all about?
Yeah, well, great question. And my first thought was, as you were talking, how interesting it is, this idea of good experiences that turn into better experiences and, good opportunities and vice versa. Because obviously, I think whether therapy or coaching, it's all about that. And I find it so interesting that this idea really of how the right experiences can make us more resilient, but when they go kind of too far, they can just be overwhelming. And it's such a kind of delicate balance, I think. But like you said, for me, they absolutely were inspiring. And to answer your question, why I got into adventure and an Italian kind of Dolomites guide, I wasn't ready to go to uni when I finished school. I knew I wanted to, and I was so clear I wanted to study psychology, but I took the opportunity to take a year off. And I know a lot of people sort of backpack around the globe and things like that. But I really had this urge to kind of go deep dive into a culture, into a place, and particularly mountains. So yeah, I took this job, and it was a beautiful place I hadn't been to before. But in the Italian Dolomites, there's actually so much history. There's World War One tunnels. There's incredible kind of metal cables called via ferrata, which you can sort of connect to and hike and scramble through these mountains. It was an amazing job in some ways because I was pretty young to do that job, and you would have this whole mix of people from very little experience. So you'd actually be, really warning them to take the mountains seriously and respect the mountains. And the other extreme of people who had more experience than me with a map and compass and tents and so on. And actually, I guess it's often a leadership lesson, isn't it? That we can't always know more than the people we lead. We can't be expected to. So actually our job as a leader is not to know everything, but to, listen to people, to bring them all together, to keep them as a team. And it was absolutely a job where you learned to do that because, like I said, I might have, really experienced people who could read storms, hours ahead, or could, cross glaciers without worrying about it. And so although I had this training, it was often about, working as a team, bringing people together and managing those big personalities sometimes too.
Well, what a great example, though, for any leader listening. Heck, and even if you're a leader, not by role or title, but in general, where you're bringing a team together. It could be your kids' little league team. It could be your family. It could be a team in business. Is that idea that the leader doesn't have to have all the answers. A good leader is a good listener who recognizes when someone has a better answer and then knows how to use that to the benefit of the entire team. And you're at a young age being able to identify that. And maybe you didn't identify it always in the moment, but I'm sure pretty quickly you recognize, because you're out in the environment, in the elements. So when somebody knows how to read the weather and you don't, you're probably going to listen to them, right? Whereas in the boardroom, sometimes in our classrooms and in our business environments, we might take someone who can read the weather and we can as a threat.
Yeah.
And so we almost don't want to take their advice because, well, I'm the one supposed to have the answer. But out there in the elements, it's survival, right? So you want to make sure you listen to all the good ideas. So I bet that was a great season of learning for you and how you've translated that into some of your practice.
It absolutely was. And, I'm sure anyone who is into the outdoors would absolutely agree how much you can learn from it. To give you one example, probably one of my hardest days out there was when a guest walked off, got into difficulty, went ahead of the group, and we had to decide whether to call out mountain rescue, which on that day was a helicopter. That cost thousands of euros, and it was a big decision. And my feeling was we didn't need to, and it was, about a guest who was physically safe, but psychologically, freaking out, understandably, way above his, comfort zone. And I was hopeful that we could sort of calm them down and bring them. And in the end, we had this debate in the team of can we not? The emergency services was called out. But yeah, perhaps obviously far from, like you say, boardroom, but actually those kind of situations where you've got to factor in where do we want to stand here? What really matters? It's, big questions actually. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. With big ramifications of making wrong decisions sometimes too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay. So then now let's transfer that over into, well, first of all, I'm just curious. I assume it sounds like you speak multiple languages.
So I speak 2.5 languages.
How do you speak a half a language? You can say it, but you can't understand it, or you can understand it, but you can't say it. That's kind of how I speak Spanish.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, entiendo. So I'm fluent in Spanish, as fluent as you can be, because I learned it as an adult. My children can correct my grammar, shockingly, and they're, the oldest one's 4, but you can see as you learn it as an adult, it's just not the same. So that was a result of, as I said earlier, being based in Colombia 8 years. But I think that gave me such an insight and respect for people who live and work in other cultures and in a second language. I threw myself into language learning incredibly intensely, and it was still difficult, So, and I had lots of support, lots of classes. Actually, when I first moved out there, I'd been learning for about a year, knowing that I was going to make the move. And my boss, before I signed on, said, don't worry, you've got a year, you can lecture in English. and then you'll start lecturing in Spanish. And I said, that sounds manageable. I will throw myself into classes and I'll do it. And then I got there and they said, actually, we could really use your help. In 4 months' time, we'd love you to teach this master's course, and it's only in Spanish. So honestly, if you need a motivation to learn a language, then being asked to lecture in it in 4 months' time, that was absolutely it.
Wow. So you say you speak 2.5. So let's be clear. You're claiming Spanish as one?
Yeah.
What's the
English,
half?
Spanish, and French, I can understand quite a lot, and I can dabble in it. So I can get by, but it's not fluent, sadly.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. You're just sitting around. I thought at this point, you should learn like 7 or 8 languages. I mean, you seem like one of those people that, could speak 7 or 8 different languages. So,
Do you know, I used to learn I used to speak Italian, and sadly it's disappeared from my brain. I think not that the brain works like this, but I had brain overload, and obviously I just didn't keep it up. And I guess like every habit, if you're not doing it, it slowly just gets hard to retrieve.
yeah, it's still in there though, as you know. You just have to go start, thickening that neural pathway again if you wanted to use it again. So let's talk a little bit about your study in the neuroscience of compassion and what you've learned there and the implications that it has on our daily lives, whether it's personally or professionally. Just maybe walk the audience through. People might not always hear the word compassion and they think, oh yeah, that's when I'm really nice to somebody. Well, let's go a little bit deeper today. Let's help people understand. Let's explore, since you're in a guide. You're going to be our exploration guide into the recesses of the human mind, on what you've learned about the neuroscience of compassion.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I would start by mentioning my guru, Professor Paul Gilbert, who is an absolute trailblazer, and the founder of compassion-focused therapy. But I think although it's a therapy, it's also a life philosophy and something we can all gain from. The idea, really, the essence of compassion is being sensitive to distress or suffering and committing to alleviate or prevent it. What does that mean? If we're just noticing suffering and not doing anything about it, then that's pity, right? That's actually not helping anyone. And that can sometimes be a kind of misnomer, or why compassion gets a bad rep. People say, well, I don't want to be nice to myself. I want to just pull my socks up and be tough on myself and get on and do it. But a big part of, I guess, the greats in compassion, it's about teaching people that actually being warm, kind, and supportive of yourself is actually the best way to improve, right? It's the best way to have high expectations, high standards, and meet them. And there's, I guess, so many ways we can persuade people to do this, but one way I always like to encourage people to think is, imagine there's a 5-year-old child in front of you. Maybe they're struggling at school to make friends, they're struggling to learn their letters, whatever it might be. And imagine how you would speak to them. You probably wouldn't say half the things you sometimes say to yourself in those difficult moments, right? So we might say to ourselves like, you idiot, why did you do that? Why did you, that embarrassing thing that I did 8 years ago at work, I'm just going to spend 20 minutes ruminating over why I did that. None of that we'd encourage, a 5-year-old to try and do, right? We'd encourage that 5-year-old with words like, you have value, you are so capable. I see all the potential in you. And I know you can do great things. And yeah, I have high expectations from you because I think you're amazing. I believe you can learn this. I believe you can do anything you want to do. But let's take it a step at a time, right? Instead of, attacking you for your mistakes, I'm going to think forward and future focus. So compassion for self and for others looks like that, right? It's about being positive, being future oriented, having high standards, but supporting people in a warm and encouraging way to do that.
Do you find that I've always felt like, and maybe you can correct me on this because you're certainly more educated than I am for sure on this one, that, compassion is really like empathy in action. It has that action orientation to it. But what I hadn't really considered, and then looking at your work here, is that self-compassion idea. We think of compassion as a lot of times as someone who's just really compassionate towards others. And we don't always think about it as far as internal, like self-compassion. And do you find that people that are compassionate toward others are naturally more inclined to be compassionate toward themselves, or no, those actually are they could be mutually exclusive?
Yeah, they're actually not that related. We've done studies on it, and
Yeah.
actually, people can be incredibly compassionate to others and be incredibly hard on themselves.
Hmm.
And so many of the people I work with would absolutely acknowledge that they fit in that box. They'll say, you know, I would look at myself in the mirror and say a million things I hate about myself. And yet, if I saw a friend, it doesn't matter what they look like, I would never dream of not just saying that, but actually thinking that. You know, I wouldn't say, I'm judging you for how you look, or I don't think you should aim for a promotion, or, you know, and it's not just about being nice to friends, right? So going back to your point of being nice and soft, compassion isn't just being nice. It's sometimes telling us what we need to hear. But the things we say in our own minds to ourselves are not truly what we need to hear very often, right? They're actually just stemming from a place of deep fear that actually, if we be more gentle and kind to ourselves or set big expectations, we're kidding ourselves, we're setting ourselves up to be disappointed. So it always, that self-criticism and self-judgment, it always comes from a place of fear, of belief that if we are more gentle with ourselves, we either won't meet expectations, we won't improve, or that we don't deserve it and that others don't think we deserve it. So it's often dismantling that fear rather than just suggesting to people what compassion looks like. We actually start with dismantling the fears and blocks that they have about it.
So then that would make sense because I don't have that same level of fear and judgment toward another person in the same way, right? So I could go be compassionate towards someone else, and I don't have those same blockers because it's not identity related to me.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I guess if you think about it as sort of rewards and, you know, how do we learn as kids? We learn through three ways, right? One is modeling. So if someone, for example, talks in a critical way to me, I'm going to start talking in a critical way to myself. Through instruction, but also through rewards, right, and consequences. So naturally, we don't get rewarded usually for criticizing people, right? Which is why typically we don't criticize our friends. Unfortunately, that happens unintentionally almost all the time in parenting, right? Where parents are really harsh and critical on their children. Often they believe that that's the best way to bring them up. So I always say to people I'm working with, if you are hard on yourself, and you've had experience of people, you know, caregivers being hard on yourself, on you, it's rarely that they're trying to make you miserable, right? It's almost always coming from a place of like, the world is tough, so I need to toughen my kid up, right? So often that's what will be happening. But if you go and do that to your friends, people will walk away from you and stop being friends with you. So I guess part of it, I would think, is around that, where we naturally get rewarded for being kind to others, and then we see that they flourish and blossom when we're gentle and kind to them. But for some reason, the internal voice, it's just very different.
Yeah, I'm sure your experiences and your upbringing have so much to do with that. What's happening in the wiring of the brain here? Talk to us a little bit about the neuroscience processes of this, of not just compassion, but it's all rooted into belief and behavior and reinforcement and habit, right? To some
Yeah.
degree.
Absolutely. So I always like the metaphor of your brain is like a big forest, right? And there's paths in that forest. And at the start, all the forest kind of paths are quite faint. But what happens is when we start to walk down a path, it's sort of very faint and it gets deeper or wider and more entrenched. And for that reason, the next time we walk through the forest, we're going to be drawn to that path. So that path represents a neural pathway, which might be, for example, a thought like, I'm not good enough. A thought like, you know, it might be connected to memories like the times that I got passed up for a promotion, right? Or I didn't get the grade that I hoped for, or my parents were disappointed in me, anything like that, right? Or it might be something like I belong, right? So feeling like an outsider, whether in the workplace, whether in your friendship groups. If your neural pathway is I'm an outsider, I'm a bit weird, I don't belong, or I'm not good enough, then the more you think about it and ruminate on it, the stronger it will get. What also happens, unfortunately, is that memories are connected, right? So neural pathways also include all those memories. And the more we think about those memories, again, the pathway will get bigger. One problem is that by having that thought, it not only shapes our thinking, it shapes our behavior. right? So I work with a lot of people who will say, well, I know, for example, I look at my friends' careers and they're doing so much better than me. And then I say, well, what's going on there, right? Why is that? And when we explore, perhaps they haven't actually put themselves out there as much as they might want to have had. So you can see it's not just beliefs lead to beliefs, but beliefs lead to behavior, right? Self-limiting. And as a consequence, then they almost like, well, I knew, it confirmed, right? It confirmed I wasn't good enough, because either we don't take interpersonal risks or professional risks, and therefore we never get a chance to prove that that pathway was not the only possible route through the forest. So I guess what I often do as a coach or as a therapist is help people forge that new path. And I always say the first time it's going to be so hard, it's going to feel like you have to get the machete out and just hack through the forest, and you're going to be tired, you're going to be exhausted, and you're going to accidentally wander down that other path. But in time, you won't need the machete anymore. And in time, if we keep working at this, every day you need to walk down it and you need to catch yourself on the other path and walk back here, in time and practice, that will become the highway through the forest.
Yeah, such a great metaphor. I think, we talk a lot about that because every time you're faced with that, and this is any habit formation, right? Every time you're faced with that thought, your inclination is to say, okay, well, that pathway that I've forged, already cleared out through the forest, I can see it. It's wide and it's going to allow me to go through the forest the quickest because that's the pathway. And you're saying, yeah, that's your unconscious instinct is to just take that path because that's the neural pathway that you spent the most time on, even though it might lead to a dark place on the other side of the forest every time. You're still going to take it.
Yeah.
And your work that you do is helping people recognize they're at the beginning of that path. They can see it. They got to get the machete out and turn right and hack their way through a different path. And just like we were talking about with speaking Italian, that pathway that they've cleared out, it's my understanding with the neuroscience research, it never actually goes away, but it will get overgrown at some point, and you won't take it because you haven't taken it in so long, the weeds kind of grow over it again. And so it's not a path you take very often. Therefore, you forget how to go down it. I.e. speaking Italian. The same thing can happen with your own self-limiting beliefs, it sounds like.
That's absolutely true. So we often, would help people think about what are the small sparkling moments that are exceptions to your main story, right? If your main story is, I'm not good enough, or I can't trust others, right? Others can't be trusted. What are the exceptions to that? And we'll start to gently build that alternative path, because for almost everyone, they will have exceptions where they did feel they belonged, where they did feel accepted or good enough. And so actually, the story is only going to feel real to them if we embed those actual good early memories of acceptance, of love, of success into their story. Otherwise, it doesn't ring true. And one of the hardest things is when people say, I can tell myself I'm competent, I just don't believe it. Right. So actually a lot of work is about emotionally connecting. And that comes from things like either bringing up memories, right, of those moments, or even, and this is one thing I research on a lot, visualizing. So you've probably heard of this idea of like sports science talk a lot about visualizing success, right? And that even if you visualize, say you've injured your knee and you can't exercise and train, if you visualize something like a jump, right, you can actually get better at it because visualizing it, you're activating that neural pathway just by imagining it in your head. So a lot of research I've done is things like shutting your eyes and visualizing someone giving you that warmth and acceptance is far more powerful than just saying the words, because you're actually connecting to the emotional network underneath the sort of logical brain. And they're two completely different pathways, right? And two completely different parts of the brain. So if you shut your eyes and visualize, for example, a delicious meal, your salivatory glands will start salivating, right? I'm sure you can do it now. Just your favorite meal, you'll just feel the salivation. And that's the incredible power of visualization. So imagine what we can do is if we visualize people accepting us, people being proud of us, people celebrating our wins.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good example. I do a lot of speaking, and I don't know that I was always confident at speaking. My teachers growing up might have said, well, you seem to act like it when you were growing up in school, you would take over a classroom. But I'm saying, I don't think I was always confident that I could walk out on a stage in front of 1,000 people and do something that was meaningful and impactful without judgment. But I think it's the visualization I learned early on of not just saying to myself mantras of, oh, I am a good speaker, but literally closing my eyes and visualizing walking up on the stage, the lights coming on, 1,000 people in the audience, getting a standing ovation, and then talking to people off stage later after the talk about the impact that what I delivered made for them. Now, you can say that sounds crazy, but I spent hours just visualizing those moments over and over again. And lo and behold, my anxiety went down with every talk I gave, and to the point now where the habits formed there are, I love it. It becomes a place of refuge for me. And people think it's crazy that I would love that as a place of refuge when it gives so many other people complete, anxiety and cortisol squirting out of their ears. But I think it's because of that exercise. So I think what you're saying is, what is it that you want out of life? Where do you want to be? And you got a lot of junk in the brain trunk, we call it. I love the expression that the most important story you'll hear in any given day is the one you're telling yourself. And it's either a good story or a bad story, but you're saying, what do you want? And then now don't just say the mantra, well, I want, to be a good mother. I want to have a good job. Visualize literally the pictures in your mind of what that looks like. And you're saying it has a different activation when you can take it to the next level like that.
Yeah. And one thing I share is there's a heuristic of the mind and the emotions by Paul Gilbert that I think is amazing, which is called the 3 circles model. You can Google it and find it. And it talks about, so there's the threat, right, which we all know is sort of full of anxiety or guilt or shame. So that system has certain feelings attached to it. And then your example, I think, of standing up on stage and it going really well would be the second circle of the drive system, right, where you're filled with dopamine and adrenaline and your goal achieving and you're sort of, ticking off things in life that you really want to do and are important to you. But we know there's a third system that's so often neglected, which is connected to the parasympathetic, so the calming system, the soothing system, it's called. And that's really there to help regulate the other two. And so often we neglect it, right? We focus either on, managing threat with drive, right? So I'm feeling anxious and I just that's the classic workaholic, right? Or perfectionist. Like I'm annoyed or disappointed in myself, so I'm just going to work harder and do more. And what we know is that can so often lead to burnout. So helping people to instead connect to that third soothing system, which is where we feel calm acceptance, is also powerful with visualization, right? So getting them to connect to oxytocin and connection with others and trust is also so important and so powerful.
So where's because I can see where you can overdrive one of those or the other, right? You can run from depending on how you respond to the first circle, which is the fear. You're a fight or flight type of activation. You have a bunch of habits on how you respond when that moment happens. Or if you're the achiever, that there's a bunch of habits in that circle where you just go. I'm going to overperform to overcome the fear. And then this third of the calm, soothing place is supposed to almost create an equilibrium. So you can look at the other two with a little more balance. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I always say to people I work with, so many of them are either workaholics or drive and they just don't stop. And I say, the relaxation isn't a guilty pleasure. It's not something that you have to feel bad about. There's literally a part of your mind designed to be soothing, to calm. And like you said, it's there to regulate the other two. It's there to almost think of washing out the dopamine, adrenaline, right? To calm them too. And why does that exist? There's a great example, which is imagine like a herd of zebra or something, right? And a lion comes up to them and terrifies them. What do? They all flock together to protect themselves, right? Or think of a baby and their parent who in danger scoops them up and soothes them. So the soothing system basically evolved or developed and is there in order to make us seek safety from others, because as humans, fundamentally, we're safer when we stick together. And so there's so much kind of neuroscience that underpins this idea that together we're stronger, together we're safer. And really it evolved to say, when you're in danger, go seek someone else out, someone safe, someone you trust, someone you know can stick around for you, and will give you a super dope dose of oxytocin when you're with others to reassure you and almost reward you so you'll come back, right? So that system's there to encourage us to seek safety with others. And therefore, if we're feeling unsafe or overwhelmed at any point in life, connection is such a good way of regulating ourselves so that we can then go out and drive, right? Because all of those systems are important. We want to use all of them, but they need to be in balance.
So it sounds like then if you've had a maybe a childhood with a lot of trauma and you weren't safe, maybe it was a relative, a parent, or somebody like that, just whether it be emotional or physical, and you learn to isolate, that trauma could really be have a detrimental impact on your ability to seek that out as an adult. So therefore you find yourself isolating as an adult, thinking that you're actually protecting yourself unconsciously, and you're limiting your ability to do that very act of going and seeking someone because you don't believe anyone's safe. Is that a fair assessment of maybe like how trauma might impact your inability to do that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, there's different terminology that you might have heard to describe this, like avoidant attachment is that fear and therefore distancing yourself. But there's lots of other things, ways of describing it. And I would actually say I think so many people will also say, I didn't have trauma with a big T. It wasn't like a really abusive environment I grew up in. One piece of research that I found, worked on, which I thought was so interesting, is actually there's a set of experiences that are like negative experiences, right? Abuse, whether, as you said, sort of physical, emotional, sexual, any kind of abuse. But there's a whole other set of experiences that are more like emotional neglect and an absence of warmth. And an absence of warmth might seem to some people like not as big a trauma, but it's incredibly problematic because there's two completely separate pathways in the brain, right? One is a bad experience makes you feel unsafe or makes you feel others are dangerous, right? Or makes you feel not good enough. But an absence of warmth actually means we are simply never created that forest path that allows us to experience warmth and acceptance and validation. So many people I work with will say, no, there wasn't a big experience in life. But when we dig down, people were maybe quite cold and distant when they were growing up. Maybe they got a lot of sort of, tough parenting of, like it's a dog eat dog world. And they'd come home and get upset and people would just tell them like, well, people have it worse than you, right? You might not think that that's a huge experience, but how is that teaching you to manage your emotions and listen to your emotions and validate yourself? And so people, as a consequence, will not only not learn to speak to themselves in the right way, in a helpful way, but also not reach out to others. So they'll struggle maybe in relationships to say what they really want, right? They'll struggle to ask for help, to ask for favors from friends. And they might seem like small things sometimes, like asking for favors, but that's a way we create strong bonds, actually.
Right. All right, well, let's transition into some action steps now. So how would I, outside of doing a series of counseling sessions with you, how would I self-assess on a scale system as I'm evaluating, like, where are my gaps and where do I have the wrong path through the forest and I haven't recognized it yet? And how do I then start to build those other ones? We talked about visualization, but is there a way you can help people think through how to self-assess, like maybe why they're not showing up every day like they want to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think be aware that the stories you tell yourself, firstly, are just stories, right? So that's so important because people will just see it as fact, right? So recognize that they are just stories. In general, we tend to do better in life if we overall believe we are good enough, competent, have many skills. We believe that we belong. And again, you might say, well, I just don't, what can I do? There's a million data points in your life and you can write that story any way you want. And actually, I would encourage you to try and write it a different way. Honestly, sometimes therapy is there for a reason because a good therapist will help you do that in a way that it's very hard to do it yourself if you're firmly embedded. But I guess, recognizing those stories you tell yourself at work, at home, however, and then noticing what happens? So there tends to be those patterns. Are you, as a consequence of that maybe unhelpful, critical story, are you avoiding situations, right? And preventing taking risks that might challenge that story? Are you surrendering and just believing the story? So you're not applying for that promotion, or you're not dating, or you're not trying to make new friends? Or are you even doing another thing, which is overcompensating, right? So you're trying, for example, so hard to make friends that you meet a new person and you just talk and talk and talk about yourself to try and desperately be interesting. And as a consequence, people are like, well, that person's too much. So I'm not saying all this to make you over criticize yourself and judge yourself. That's the last thing I'd want to do. Sometimes we need to just relax a bit actually and not over worry. But noticing, being aware and tuning into the evidence and the reactions from people is a good way of doing that.
Yeah, we could go on a whole nother episode around, emotional intelligence and self-awareness and all that. And, I was thinking about this it's not just the story we tell ourselves every day, because it sounds like that there's a story. I recognize that it's a constant loop. Like you're filling in a narrative blank. Like right now, there's a loop happening unconsciously in my mind as I'm asking you questions, and all of my past and my history and my knowledge and experience and everything is telling me some kind of a loop about. Well, I wonder how the audience is taking how she answered that, and I wonder how does Iona think I'm a good interviewer, and am I asking? So we're constantly telling, like it's in constant motion, right? As soon as we're awake, the loop.
Don't do that. Yeah, you shouldn't do that, but we all do it.
Yeah, but I guess that's the point, is that we're all doing it. So the only way to break it is to put yourself in a habit of pausing every now and then and go, okay, what loop am I in right now? Is it a positive loop, or is it a fear-based loop that's not serving me? And getting into the habit of just pausing throughout the day and go, and just out of curiosity, what loop am I in right now? What story what am I doing right now? And I'm probably doing something as a result of an output of the loop that I've been telling myself. And then now that I'm doing something, what is the loop that I'm reinforcing why I'm doing this?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's a tough.
And I would say mindfulness is based on the evidence and based on my clinical experience, it is such a great tool for helping you notice which loop you're in and getting out of it, right? Mindfulness basically is paying attention to the present moment without judgment. And what are you doing if you're in the present moment? You're not in the past ruminating over the stupid thing you did 5 minutes ago. You're not in the future worrying what's going to happen next tomorrow in a year's time. And you're not judging yourself, right? You're just noticing. So mindfulness and practicing that every day is absolutely something I'd recommend to everybody. It's a brilliant skill. And again, it's something that naturally we need to do and ought to do and used to do an awful lot more. And in the modern day world, there's not a lot of space for mindfulness, but it's incredibly helpful.
Wow. Okay. Now I have to go sit in the closet for about an hour and think about everything we just talked about, Iona. Thank you for ruining my day. No, I'm kidding. This is such good stuff. And unfortunately, we're out of time for today. But I think we may have to have you back on again, later on this season to talk about, let's build out a roadmap with some practical tools and tips. We've talked a lot of conceptual stuff with a few practical things. I just wanted the audience to think about some of these things, and you see it every day and you're working through it every day. And your story is one of, we're all on an adventure. The question is how adventurous are you? And, some of us have taken the art of curiosity to another level, like yourself, becoming a free diver and working in multiple countries and being an adventure guide, and then also diving then into the mind and understanding how we're wired. I still firmly believe that we're spiritual beings in a physical plane, not physical beings in a spiritual plane. And so learning to understand that, the spiritual side of who we are, that voice inside of us, and that mindfulness that you're giving us a lot of encouragement to explore, I think has been a good level set for me today as I go out, because we're kicking off a new year and so much going on, and you can get on the treadmill so fast. And I was just thinking, as you said that, how easily I fast forward to the future in my loop and trying to predict the future. So then my behaviors are aligned to something I think might happen. And so I miss a lot of moments because of it. I think that's the big takeaway for me on this too. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or encouragement for the audience?
No, well, I love what you said. I absolutely believe, there is a place, as you said, for reflecting on the past, on the future, and so on. But there is a place for just trying to notice the moment and be in the moment. I would encourage you all to think about those 3 circles and notice which system do you spend more time in. Have a Google look at those systems and think which do you want to be in? Do you need a bit more soothing in your life? Do you need a bit more drive? How can you regulate, and how do you regulate your threat? Because we all have those, but it's about learning to use the tools. And there's so many tools out there, but I think it's practicing and knowing the right ones to help you live your best life.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your story. Thank you for your expertise. And for those listening who are interested in learning more about Dr. Iona Naismith, there'll be links in the show notes as well as the landing page for the podcast episode. And you can jump in, connect with her on LinkedIn, follow her, do all the stuff and find out all the tools that she does. She does coaching as well as some therapy sessions. And she's putting some really good stuff out in the universe. And it was an honor to have you on to the Driving Change podcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's my pleasure. Thanks.